Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Dawn with K-Squared Technologies. Welcome to our monthly webinar training series. Today's session is a continuation. It's part 2 of our look at Microsoft Excel functions. In our first part, we covered function basics, understanding references, range names, data analysis functions, and we're going to continue that look at data analysis functions in this part, as well as explore other types of functions that you can use in Excel. Date functions, text functions, and some tricks that don't even require functions. If you missed the first part of our Microsoft Excel functions training, check out the K-Squared Technologies YouTube channel. And that's where you will find all of our webinars, and that it will give you a good foundation for this course. Let's go ahead and dive in to our continued look at Excel functions. In our first session, we covered a number of analysis functions, including if, COUNTIF, AVERAGEIF, and we're going to now move to VLOOKUP. This is a really valuable function in your toolbox. This can be really helpful for you when you want to automate rather than having to do so many things manual. So VLOOKUP means vertical lookup. First of all, let's talk about the arguments and then some of the applications for that. VLOOKUP uses 4 different pieces. So when we talk about a lookup, it means that we're going to a source of data. So it might be a master list of customers. Maybe it's a worksheet of your products. Perhaps it's various accounting or category codes that you have. But you have some sort of a list that you would like to bring into another worksheet. It doesn't even have to be in the same workbook. So for our examples, we'll be working within the same workbook to simplify it, but it doesn't have to, as long as it's a workbook you have access to. This can be helpful when you're downloading data from another system, and maybe you have a code, but you don't have all the detail. So with a VLOOKUP, we have these 4 different pieces. And by the way, there's also an HLOOKUP for horizontal and other lookup functions. We're going to look at actually XLOOKUP here in a little bit. But VLOOKUP is certainly the most common. So the first part is, what are you looking up? The second part is, where are you looking? And this is where range names can be really valuable. And that's something we covered in our first session. And then once you go to, when we say, where are you looking? Once you go to the source of the data, which column in that source has that lookup information? And then finally, is this an exact lookup or an approximate match? And we'll talk more about that because this can be a little bit confusing, unfortunately, in that whole setup. So let's look at a very simple example here. Here I have data where I have an identifier, but I want to populate the rest of the worksheet. And too often we're doing this manually. We have room for error, and it simply is time consuming when really we're looking for this and other functions to help automate our work. So we want to be able to take this employee ID to a data source and bring back information like the division name, last name, and supervisor. So that's the idea of a VLOOKUP. Now where it's going, So this is the first part of that argument, will be what am I looking up? Now where it's going happens to be to another worksheet in this workbook. And keeping in mind, it could be in another workbook, and it doesn't even have to be even in the same folder. So this is the data source that we're looking up. To simplify this process, I've named the data employees, given it a range name. Now you don't have to have range names, but I find that that's, and talked more about how this can simplify your work as you are working with applying many of these different functions. So in this case, this range name doesn't have to include the headings. It includes the first data source here. Now that happens to be the first column. It doesn't have to be. That is, if there were, maybe this employee ID is not in column A, it's in column C, and then we go from there. But the column that has the data in it that we're looking up does have to be the first column of the range name. You'll see how that's different with XLOOKUP, but that's the idea with it. So we're going over to this data source. And with the VLOOKUP, first of all, it's going to find a match for that employee ID, whatever that is. So if this is the one we were looking up, it would simply come down that column until it finds a match. Now, what we want to bring back and populate our worksheet with is that we want to see the last name, we want the division and the supervisor. That's where we need to know what the column is. Now in Excel, we're used to thinking of the column as something that is A, B, C, D, etc. However, if we go back to looking about that range, whether it's a range name or it's you simply have put in the literal range. These are actually columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it would continue. Because in some of your projects, you may have many, many, many more columns. So we have to tell it what column has the matching data. So that means, for instance, for the last name, that's column 2. For the division, that's 6. Supervisor is 7. So it's counting and including the first column. And remember, that doesn't have to be column A, it's the first column of the range that you're specifying. And that first column needs to include whatever it is you're looking up. Now, in this case, we need it to be what's called an exact lookup. That is, we can't just come up with an employee name ID that's close. That's like a social security number or maybe a product identifier. So that is something we'll also manage within building this formula for a VLOOKUP. There are approximate ranges used much less commonly. That is probably for most of you, then you will only use an exact lookup. So there might be a few exceptions, and I will share with you what that might look like. Keep in mind, if you have any questions, please drop those into chat. I'm happy to address those as we can related to the various functions that we will be looking at. So this is where we're looking for the data. And let's build that VLOOKUP in terms of working with it. So I've shared before that if I want to navigate very easily to other worksheets, I can go to the right bottom left-hand corner and right click on either one of those triangles and then move to other worksheets. So let's come back to this one. Now, also, as I shared, there's a lot of different ways to build functions. We could build it directly, just typing it in. For this one, I'll use the insert function. simply to help walk through this, especially if you're brand new to working with VLOOKUP. So insert function is found to the left of our formula bar or in the formulas tab. Either one of those is an option. And from here, what I want is VLOOKUP. Now, it may be in my list of recently used. If it isn't, I can find it under my lookup and reference or under all. So here's VLOOKUP. And the first thing we need to provide is what are we looking up? And that will be this employee ID. The second argument is where are we looking? So we saw this briefly before as we were moving into this. So that table array. Now that's where employee names, or excuse me, that's where range names, in this case, this is employees, range names are really helpful. So we could navigate to wherever that range is and highlight it. In this case, I'll simply type in employees. Now we'll look here to the right-hand side, and this is where Excel is helping us to confirm that we're on the right track. Here's my lookup value. This happens to be what it is. Table array. It's showing us then the first values in that range name. So that helps to confirm that we didn't have a spelling error, or that it recognizes that range name. And then here we have the column index number. That's the technical way of basically saying is what do we need to match to? And for the division, this is going to be column 6. Now, based upon that, we're already seeing here an answer. But we have one more important part. Technically, this is optional, but it really shouldn't be. Anytime you do a VLOOKUP, always make sure that you have an answer here. And the answer here should be either true or false. So not yes or no or anything else. True, the question is this a range lookup? And know that almost all the time, if not all the time, it's not. So in this case, I want to say false. It is. The other way to think of it is rather than a range lookup, we want an exact match. So if it's an exact match, it has to find that exact identifier, nothing close to it, then put in false. So it should always be required. So this is then the structure of this VLOOKUP. And notice that as we're using insert function, we can see this starting to take place on our screen. All right, so let's go ahead and continue, and I will copy this down. Now I could also, as I mentioned, create it manually. And I could copy this across, but there's be so much editing that it might not make a lot of sense. And I'll show you how you can fix that too in just a moment. So for instance, if I wanted to manually create this, I could say, let's say for the last name equal VLOOKUP. So I start typing, I'll hit either double click on that or hit tab. What's my lookup value? So you can see that Excel is prompting you for those arguments. Where am I looking? I start typing employees. I can arrow to that, double click or hit tab. So that's my range name. Another reason that can be really helpful for this, the last name is the second column in that range. And once again, now you can see the prompting for this. In this case, it's an exact match. So we put false. So that's another way to build this. And in Excel, we could put in the closed parentheses, but Excel will build it for us. So that would be another way for us to construct this VLOOKUP. Now, if you have a lot of them, there's even a better way. So let's look at what that might be. I'll go ahead and clear these, and I'm actually going to clear these other ones as well. Talked in the last session about the concept of relative, absolute, and circular references. Really important to be able to have those be clear. So if I want to, I could say, if I want to take this formula and be able to copy it across maybe for many, many other columns that have different key data, I'm going to edit this and put in a $sign. By putting in a $A, that means go to column A. But I'm not putting a $sign in front of the 4 because I want that to be relative. I want that to be able to copy down. For you, that might be hundreds or thousands of rows. But I do want to, regardless of where this formula is, having it be an absolute reference says absolutely always go to column A, regardless of the location of the formula. That gives us some more flexibility. So now that I have this with the $sign, I'll drag it down. It didn't change the results. It shouldn't change the results. It just gives us more flexibility if we're creating this many times over. Now, I'm going to copy this across. Now, and you can see it's still going to column A, and it's just giving us that answer because all I need to do now is edit this because my last name is found in column 2. And my supervisor is found in column 7. So now I'll take this and copy it down. And we'll expand this column a little bit. So for instance, because I have that absolute reference, I'm able to build off of the formula I already had and then be able to just customize it to change the column that it will look up. So that's the idea of a VLOOKUP for an exact match. Now there's one other piece here that just want to mention as well. We talked in our first session about functions, about different if statements. And there certainly could be a situation where perhaps we're looking up a value and it's not found. Well, that doesn't look like a very friendly response, and it might be really difficult if you have multiple people working with your data. So know that you could leave it like this. Just know that that's going to indicate there's some sort of error. Whenever we see a pound sign as the first entry, that is some sort of an error. So there is a way to capture that. It adds a little bit more complexity, but let's look at how that might work. So the idea with this is to nest a VLOOKUP in another function called if error. So let's come into this to look at this. I'll move to the very beginning of it. And I'm going to just make this even just a little bit bigger for you because there's, now we're adding some other layers to this. If error is the function. This is what happens if there's an error. So this can be helpful, especially if you have multiple people working in that project. Open parentheses. Here's the entire calculation. So you want to successfully build that function, but now I'm nesting it inside of if error. So this is what I'm going to be doing. This is my calculation, so I haven't changed anything with the VLOOKUP. But we come to the end of that, comma, and if we want it to have a message, maybe you just wanted to put in a value, that would be fine if that made sense for the logic. But in this case, I'm going to put in quotes. Talked in our previous session that we put text in quotations when it's a character string. When we have something that is not a function name, it's not a cell address, it's not a range name, we simply want to introduce text. So in this case, by putting in quotes, we're able to introduce this as text if there is an error with that. So in this case, I'll go ahead and close that And then I could copy this down. And I could then continue editing the other ones as well. So that's the idea then of not only working with VLOOKUP, but also how we can build on that data analysis by also building in ways to handle situations where there might be an error. So if error is one other layer or level that you can build on. So something to consider as another piece there. Now, with the VLOOKUP, if you find that this might be helpful for you, I did want to just introduce and give you a sense of how VLOOKUP would be used for approximate matches. So even though it's less likely, it doesn't mean that you might not have an application for it. So in this case, the situation is that we might have a range of values. Maybe you have a situation that is if it falls between 1 and 5, here's an answer. If it's greater than 5, less than 10, it's another answer, that type of thing. So that is then where you have a VLOOKUP with an approximate match. Very simple example of that, but let's look at this. So I have an amount that I'd like to look up. Once again, where I'm looking could be even in another workbook. I'm going to, and I want to figure out what the discount amount is. So yes, I would like to be able, I don't necessarily want to spend that much money to get that, but yes. So very simplified example. Now I don't have to use a range name for this, but just to show you then the simplicity of that, I will highlight not including the headings, that's not necessary. And I'm going to then go into the name box. We covered creating range names in our first half of this session in part 1. And I'm going to label this as discount. Now then, assuming I do not already have a range name called discount. Couple things about this. Unlike when it's an exact match, this has to be sorted from low to high. That is the lookup value in this case, which is the amount. Has to be sorted from low to high. Because what will happen is that whatever we have entered here, in this case 800, is going to drop into the table and move down until it finds a match that is not greater than the value. So it will stop at this level. That's why it has to be sorted from low to high. So how do we build this? Once again, VLOOKUP. So I'll type this out in this case, as we did before. My lookup value, comma, where am I looking? It's discount. So you can see that when you have this formula autocomplete, you'll see range names as well as function names suggested. So discount, comma, it's column 2. And is it an approximate match or an exact match? In this case, approximate match. And I'll close that. So now we're getting the 2%. Now, one of the reasons we have this is that we don't want to have to capture every possible instance. That's not even going to help us or save us time. Well, we can see here, for instance, if we had a purchase amount here, for instance, and we enter that in, now it's going to stop here because the next level is higher. And that's the idea of an approximate match. So that is yet another application. Let's then look, and hopefully you have some applications for VLOOKUP. Or perhaps if you've seen other projects that people have done, now you have a better understanding for how it works. And keep in mind with the insert function, you can go to an existing formula like this VLOOKUP and also select insert function. And sometimes just by seeing it broken out here where you can see the different arguments, sometimes that can be helpful as well. just to understand someone else's logic, especially if you have multiple functions nested in there. One of the fairly new functions is something called XLOOKUP. XLOOKUP. Now, there's a couple of things to know about this. First of all, it can be extremely handy because it has a lot of flexibility that VLOOKUP does not have. But know that it's only available to Microsoft 365 subscribers. And it's not backwards compatible. So if you have Microsoft 365, you can use XLOOKUP. But if you're sharing any of your data externally to people that may not have 365, then you have to hold off on using XLOOKUP. But XLOOKUP gives us a lot of flexibility that we don't have with VLOOKUP. It is considered a replacement in many ways for VLOOKUP, and also there's some functions called index and match that can be used for some complex data analysis that, once again, this can work for us as well. So XLOOKUP can work horizontally and vertically, and it assumes an exact match. So it has some other arguments that are optional, but it assumes an exact match versus the reverse, where VLOOKUP assumes that it's an approximate match, and you have to make sure that you put in the argument too, so that it knows it's an exact. So those are some considerations with this. Let's look at how this might work. So first of all, if we look at the data for an XLOOKUP, the nice thing about it is that you do not have to have that lookup value, in this case, the employee ID, doesn't have to be in the first column of the specified area. So this gives us a lot more flexibility. And each of the data areas that we work with will be indicated separately. So rather than counting from left to right, then it's going to be a separate range you specify. So once again, range names can be really helpful there. And that can also be helpful, whereas in the previous example with just a VLOOKUP, if a new column was added, then you would have to go back and edit the logic on that, because now you've changed the order. So in this case, we have a range name for the employee ID. We have one for division. We have one for supervisor. So you can see all of these are different options in terms of how we might work with it. So that's another consideration as well. So these are all separate ranges, and we can still take it to this location, but it can look up to the left, it can look up to the right, and so that gives us a lot more options. So let's see how this works. So it is called XLOOKUP. And in this case, I've already created the formula so that you can kind of see the idea of it. It also tends to have simpler logic to it. In this case, what's the lookup value? I've made that a absolute reference, so it's easier to copy over. And in this case, that is going to the employee ID. Where is it looking? Well, it's going to be looking in that range employee ID. What is it going to be bringing back? Whatever it finds as a match in the division range of data. And then these others have been edited accordingly. So rather than a column number, it's a range that it's looking. So whether it's a literal range or range name, that's what we have there. Now we could still nest this inside of the if error as we saw before, but this becomes yet another solution in that we have a lot more flexibility, because with VLOOKUP, we sometimes have to rearrange the order of the data so that it will match that left to right approach. So the XLOOKUP might be something to consider. One, if you have Microsoft 365, but also if you want to have that flexibility. So it's really going to be an option to look at moving forward. And don't be concerned that VLOOKUP is suddenly going to go away. That's not really a concern, but it's something just to know that it is another option for us. So I hope this is giving you some ideas for your analysis. We're building on what we covered last month. And I definitely, if you missed that, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and check that out. So let me know if you have any questions about what you've seen so far. But this is the idea here: VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP. You got a chance to see if error as well as some additional data analysis tools for you. And know that if you're going across workbooks, you're also creating links. So those are automatically creating links for you because you are moving and referencing locations in another workbook. So that's another consideration, because when it's a link, then if that data you're linking to is moved or renamed, you may have to then make edits to your workbook as well. So just some considerations to keep in mind. That wraps up our look at some of the data analysis functions that are available. But we also have some powerful options with date and text functions. So I definitely wanted to give you a look at what might be possible there as well. For our date functions, there are two key ones that can be really useful for you. And the first is equal now. So equal now, open parentheses and close parentheses. And so equal now and equal today. So now and today, those are two date functions that do not require any arguments. They represent the current date. So that, of course, that date is going to change. As the date, the difference between those is now, depending upon how you format your cells, the now can also display the time. Now, this is not going to be ticking away every moment. It only changes as we make changes to the content of the workbook and the worksheets. So equal now gives us the opportunity to also display the current time. Equal today is the current date, but not the time. So just some distinctions for those. But these can be really helpful for you in building out calculations, especially if you're tracking projects and other types of deliverables and reporting. So for instance, here we have date received and then date completed. So these are just entered in. But now we want to know or track, especially if we had many, many records here, we might want to track or figure out, how many days is it open? Is it completed? And so we can actually build in some logic. So let's look at what this formula does, for instance. This is a formula leveraging the if function. It's also using another function, is blank, and it's using the today function. So what is this saying? First of all, it's just analyzing if date completed, column B, is blank. So it would assume that we have some consistency or best practices in terms of how that works. So the if, as you may recall, is that we will have three parts. We're testing something, and then we'd say, what happens if it's true? And then what happens if it's false? So this is the test. If that cell is blank, then if that is true, take the current date, that is today, minus the date received, and that tells us how many days it's been open. If it's not blank, that's the third part of the if statement, then say done. Remember, here we get back to the character string again. That is, we're putting a statement in quotes so that we can display text without an error in that message. So that's what's happening in this column. And then, for instance, if we have a change, so let's just say that this is completed, and this was completed in February 1st, then it would automatically become done. And that's one of the values of the if statement that we looked at earlier, is that it can automatically populate rather than having to manually hope that you're keeping on top of it. Now, for tracking purposes, we may want to also do date calculations. So this is just here as a reminder that a date has a numeric value, and it actually has, if we go back to the beginning of last century, it's called the Julian calendar, but we basically are looking at this to say that every day has a number. So today's number is going to be one number less than tomorrow's, and it continues forward. So because dates have a numeric value, we can then do calculations with them, such as taking that date received and adding 90 days to it to see what that looks like. We can also do calculations where we can subtract one date from another. So here again, another if statement. And as a reminder, remember that we can always go into insert function if you find it's easier to see some of these this way. So it's an if statement, is blank, that is, if date completed is blank, then say open. Otherwise, take the date completed minus the date received to find out how many days it took to complete that project. So that's the idea then, with some date functions that are helpful for, in this case, for the current date. We also have some others that you might want to explore in more detail. And these are month, year, end of month, EO month, and date. So these let you, if you have a date, there might be situations where you only want to extract certain parts of it, especially for sorting and filtering. And that's what these will do. So for instance, in this column, this is using the month function that is simply giving us the numeric for the month, and we could sort and filter on that. Or the year function, which is as appropriate, the year for that. But we can also use things like the end of month and date, depending upon how you maybe your counting systems and other types of deadlines that you have. So what this one, for instance, does is it just is showing us what is the end of the month of this value, and then comma 2, that's 2 months ahead. It could be 1 month ahead. It could be 0, but you know, could say, I could just want to know what's the end of the month for that month. That would be fine too if I made that 0. But the idea here, once again, is we're able to automate rather than having to do this manually. That's always the goal that we have in looking at these functions in Excel. So explore these additional functions and how they might be helpful for you. We have a few other date functions that also could be something to consider in your Excel toolbox. And so definitely something to explore. What these are 2 functions that are called workday and network days. Here again, when we're doing tracking, maybe we have different accountability for deadlines, various projects. There might be situations where you only want to consider business days. That is, you don't, if you say that it's in 10 days, is that 10, counting that holidays and weekends, or is it 10 business days? So these give you the opportunity to be able to more accurately then depict what these timeframes might look like. So as an example, if I have a date received and I want to, this is just to show you, for instance, if I just add 30 days to it, this is what it would look like, okay? However, I really might want to know what 30 days is from receipt business days, excluding holidays. So not just weekends, that is, though these functions already know how to exclude weekends, which is nice, right? And it's assumed that it's US. Now there's an international version, but in this case, we're simply looking at it from assuming that Saturday and Sunday are excluded. But we also have holidays that can often fall into these. So how this works is that I have a separate holidays tab. Now, this could be in another workbook, and in this case, it could be multiple years. So I just have US federal holidays here. I could give this a range name. I don't have to, but in this case, then whatever days I want to exclude, whether we call them holidays or something else, whatever days I want to exclude so that they are not counted with that. So here's how the workday looks. And let's go ahead and look at that once again under the insert function. It's a pretty straightforward. You can see the logic here. What's my start date? How many days do I want to add to it? And optionally, I could exclude certain holidays. And in this case, I have those referenced. So that gives us now, this tells us what 30 days is from the receipt. And so you can see how dramatically different those results are based upon only working with business days. Then if we have a date completed, once again, if we just do a standard calculation, that is going to show us some different results when we're, especially when we're tracking performance, for instance. So here again, we can, if we want calculations between two dates, the net work days function will also exclude weekends and optionally holidays. So how does that work? You'll see the logic here on screen, but we have our starting date, which is the date received, our date completed. And so that's doing the calculation here. And then we are excluding those holidays. So it doesn't have to be a range name. It's just often in a lot of projects, range names will simplify it, especially when it's a large range. So with this now we get much different results because we're excluding weekends and holidays. And hopefully that gives you as well some other ways to be more accurate when you're working with date calculations. And then finally, one of the places where you can save a significant amount of time is with text functions. So let's explore some of your options with text functions in Excel. It'd be nice if the data that we receive from other people, from different systems, was already nice and clean and ready to go. But too often, we have many things we have to change, whether it's just a data entry error, maybe it's because it comes from a system that capitalizes something and we don't want it that way, or whatever the situation might be. How can we make our data more consistent? And here again, do it automatically so that you are not having to manually edit it over and over again. So one of the options that can help us here are three functions: proper, upper, and lower. They all work the similar way. You simply would enter in the name of the function, in this case, proper. What is it I want to change? And I'll reference that cell. And we'll copy this down. So proper capitalizes the first letter of each word. Upper, of course, is all uppercase, and lower is all lowercase. Once you have those results, then if you're happy with what you see there, you can select I will copy, Control C is one way to copy. And I'll simply right click here and paste values. That is, if I no longer need those functions anymore and I want to be able to then actually change this data. So actually change this data, no function. Maybe I want to copy it somewhere else, or I simply might even want to replace on top of this original data. That would be fine too. So proper, upper, and lower. But when we have text, there's also some other ways that we might work with text. Maybe we want to combine the text, or we want to separate it, split it out. So there's different things as well to consider. One of the functions that helps us with that is something called concat. And it was previously concatenate. You can still use that, but it has just been, we'll say, updated to concat. Think of it as a combine. Here's how it works. Just simply say equal concat. So if you're used to concatenate, it'll be around for a while. No worries about old worksheets you might have with that. But here I want to combine. Now I want to see my last name, comma, and then a first name. So I actually want to physically see or display the comma. I want the last name. So what happens with concat? You will provide all the things you want to combine together. You separate those with a comma. If you want to add any characters that are not part of your worksheet, then use your, once again, provide character strings. So here I will actually want to put in that I want it's the last name, then I want to see a comma and a space. So that is in quotes. So this is the punctuation. It's the other comma was simply to say, and there's more, and there's more. Another comma. These are simply to say, oh, there's more I'm going to add, which in this case is the first name. So that's our concat. Now we're able to combine, and we can copy that down. Now we can also combine without having to use a function. It's very similar. It's just using the @ sign. We basically say equal to, let's say I just want the first name and the last name. I could go to first and quote, space, quote, and last name. So not even needing to use a function. So the concat works, the and sign works, either one. But there's one other piece that can be a problem. Not only do we have possibilities of uppercase, lowercase, those kinds of things, but we also can have what are called leading and trailing spaces. It can be a data entry issue, it can be a system issue, but when you want to get rid of those spaces that might be at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even on the end, then there's a function called trim, T-R-I-M. If there's spaces, for instance, here we have spaces, you know, Tommy Tomato, there's spaces in front, there's spaces at the end. So one space between words would be allowed, but no more than that. Here's an example of how we might use trim. So this is a place where we're actually using 3 different functions. First is the concat, which is combining. Then our first name and our last name and the space. We want to take those results and make them proper. So we just apply proper, even if it already has the proper capitalization. If some of them do not, we're applying proper. So we're putting that in, or nesting the concat inside of proper. And then finally, at the very outside, we use trim. So trim is basically just saying remove any leading or trailing spaces. And that's why we get these results. And once again, if these are the results you're happy with, you can always copy and paste values. Mention just briefly 3 other text functions and then share with you that we might not even need them. And actually one other as well. So we have left, mid, and right. The intention of those, it's pretty straightforward, is maybe I want to extract what's the leftmost from an entry. And how many characters would that be? So in this example, I want the first 3 characters from the left. Or mid, which is where I have to give it a starting place, and then how many characters. So it's the middle. Or right, which moves from the right. So pretty straightforward. Once again, extracting only a portion. Because here again, we can have various systems that might work for one project, but then we really only want that code that's right in the middle, or we only want the entry that's at the front. And that's where left, mid, and right can be really helpful for you. There's also a find function. So when you have something more complicated, that is, I want to only pull out this code that starts with DEN, but it's not necessarily found at a certain position. It's just found somewhere in there. You can use a find function to find that particular value so that you can have a starting location. So this find will actually give you that starting position for the mid, and then you can have 12 characters. So find would be one of the options. But these text functions might not even be necessary because of something that is really handy in Excel, and that is flash fill. So if you haven't worked with it before, you're going to get ready to just ooh and ah and be very excited about how easily this could be accomplished. Flash fill is not using functions. Flash fill is using artificial intelligence that is going to continue to get smarter and smarter built into Excel. So here's the idea. I have a data set. Now, I've inserted a new column because I want the supervisor last name and just make that even clearer. Flash fill works easiest if you're going to be next to the data that you want to work with, but you can even be a couple columns over and it usually works. What's happening is it's looking for a pattern. So we would want there to be some consistency with this, and we might have to do some editing, and sometimes we just have to kind of coax it along if it pauses or if it needs a little update, but it's really pretty smart. Here's how this works. Instead of entering this in, that is, here's my supervisor last name. I'm going to start giving Excel the pattern. I don't have to turn anything on or write a function here. Now, notice what happens. Now's your time to ooh, ah, because look, how easy is that? Excel is looking for the pattern and it's suggesting, is this what you want? If it isn't, just keep typing. But if it is, hit enter. Now, if anything gets stalled out, for instance, because of a middle initial or multiple last names, you may simply need to go to that particular cell and edit it and then continue the flash fill from there. But it is a huge time saver. Notice that this is just a data value. This is not a function. It's just extracting what you want from that data. Let's look at another example. What if I want only the middle of this entry? So I could have used the mid function, but I don't need to. So I will type that in. Let's see what kind of pattern might come up. There we go. That's all I needed to do. Now, I'll select this. I'm holding down Shift and Control down so that I can show you another example. What if I only want from the left? That's where we could use a left function, but once again, we might not need to. Now, because this is a number that's pulling it, since it's pulling it from text, sometimes we might want to reformat this as a text field so that you might have those things, or you might just have this issue where it didn't quite take, didn't quite fill. So let's try a keyboard shortcut, Control E to fill. And that might be all you need, Control E, to tell it, hey, help me out here and fill this, and then format those results any way you want. Just confirm that it looks like it found that. And if I only wanted the first 2 characters, that would be fine too. When we are extracting something that might have leading zeros, such as this, then it's a good idea for us to first format those cells as text. So those tend to work more successfully. But that's the idea of the flash fill and how it can also help you with your text and being able to more successfully get the results that you need. I'm hopeful that you have multiple takeaways today, that you've discovered more options in terms of how you can work with your data by exploring these Excel functions. We continue to offer these types of training sessions for you, absolutely free. So K-Squared Technologies has these monthly training webinars. They're typically on the 2nd Tuesday of the month. Next month, it will be the 3rd Tuesday. But look for us. If you're not in a newsletter, you should be, because that's how we share these upcoming training schedules and the links for being able to register. We also will, this training will be then published to our YouTube channel, so you'll have a chance to reference that back if there's something you want to see again. So I hope you'll join us next month for Microsoft Word tips and techniques for collaboration tools. And then in April, we'll explore time-saving Microsoft Office keyboard shortcuts. In a few minutes, a survey, when we wrap up, a survey will pop up asking you not only for your feedback about these training opportunities, but also to get some ideas about what you'd like to see as well. So we look forward to having you join us in the future to really build your software skills and to really make the most of these applications. So that's been our look at working with functions in Microsoft Excel. How can we help you to be more productive? Please reach out to us for IT services and consulting to support you with Microsoft Technologies. I'm Dawn with K-Squared Technologies. Thanks for joining us.